Hi guys, and welcome to our fifth video on Unit 3 about the influence of revolutionary ideals. So we are going to be looking at, as I just said, 3.6, the influence of revolutionary ideals. And it is really important to keep in mind, and I think we already know this, that the American Revolution was in many senses, yes, revolutionary, and then in other ways, not so much. For example, in the Constitution, there is no mention of women or Native Americans or enslaved people or African Americans. So the revolution was very revolutionary in some ways and pretty limited in other ways. So we're going to kind of look at that today. So first of all, how did the revolution shift people's thinking and thoughts about rights and equality? So it definitely was a big revolution in terms of class relationships. Okay, the revolution set loose these kind of forces that the founding fathers never really anticipated, or to be honest, wanted. These were socially leveling forces. Don't forget, the founding fathers were elites, right? They were the planters, they were landowners, they were merchants, they were the upper class. They had money, and all of a sudden, they're setting loose, these things that all they really wanted to do was to get rid of the British and not have to pay the taxes and to be able to kind of run their own government. And all of a sudden, you have these anti aristocratic and pro egalitarian forces that have been, released. We're also going to see a big decline in indentured servitude. Less and less people are willing to sign up for terms of indentured servitude. And abolition of slavery as a real position emerges. It was sort of a fringe movement, to be completely honest, in the colonial era, but in the with the establishment of the United States in the late 18th century, it's going to become like the idea of abolitionism is no longer just a Quaker position. So Vermont and unsurprisingly Pennsylvania with the Quakers are the very first states to abolish slavery. But by 1800, all northeastern states except New Jersey are free states, are states where slavery is abolished. So this is where we're going to start to see the setting up of this sort of north-south divide. But we're going to talk about that later on in Unit 5. So the another big step is going to be the elimination of state-supported religion. Okay, with freedom of religion is going to emerge as a right in many of the new states, even in Massachusetts, which was formerly very much dominated by the Puritan Church. There is no dominant state religions anymore, thanks to the Great Awakening, and New England is definitely going to see the birth of a lot of new religious denominations because of the First Great Awakening. Virginia's statute for religious freedom in 1786. This is just one of the many states that established statutes about religious freedom. And this one was written by Thomas Jefferson, and it becomes the forerunner for First Amendment protections. In 1786, the Revolutionary War is over, but the Constitution has not yet been written. And this statute for religious freedom is going to basically form the framework for our First Amendment protections about when it comes to freedom of religion. Okay, so we also see the establishment of state government. So under the very first founding document of the United States, the Articles of Confederation, we have very, very, very weak national power. So the state governments, the way they're set up, is really, really important. So across the board, we're seeing these very common themes in all these different state governments. First of all, they limit the governmental power. They establish systems of checks and balances. They reject the monarchy. They make it illegal to bestow aristocratic or noble titles. And this is something that later on we will see in the articles, or excuse me, in the Constitution as well. They're going to put a big emphasis on civic and public virtue, as in to be a good citizen, you must take part in government as much as is possible, depending on your position. We're going to start to see political equality and egalitarianism, big movements for increased enfranchisement. So across the board, we're going to start to see the landholding requirements, prerequisites for voting are going to start to fall away. Now, this is not perfect political equality, obviously, because you still have to be a white man to vote, but we are starting to see the class aspect is going to start to fall away. You have to own land to be able to vote, to be able to politically participate. That's going to start to fall away. We also have this notion of like anti-deference. They start to disregard this notion that some people are just socially better than others, and start to emphasize that more people can climb the social ladder. The national government had a lot of these very same themes. The first form of government under the Articles of Confederation was just really these loosely tied together states that only could unite kind of when it was necessary. So the national government is going to be pretty similar, see similar themes to the state government. So in terms of the role of women, that is going to shift as well. So this pro-egalitarian thought is going to stretch to ideas of gender equity also, at least in some people's minds, not everybody's minds, but certainly some women, especially women who contributed in major ways to the revolution, who worked to contribute to the revolution, are going to start to see themselves as having a more important and powerful political role. So patriot women pick up these notions of liberty and they start to emerge as activists. They are vital to the success of boycotts against English goods because women were consumers. They were the ones who were shopping for the household. So they were really important to the success of these early measures against English taxes and English customs duties. So during the war, women played a huge role. I mean, men were away at war. When they were absent, women maintained household and farms and carried on commerce and businesses. They formed associations to help supply the troops. Many of them engaged as spies. Many of them were camp followers. Some of them even served very famously as soldiers, like Molly Pitcher, for example, which was not her real name, but what they called her because she brought water to the soldiers. And increasingly, we're going to start to see women as having a political role as well. So this is where we develop the idea of Republican motherhood. So liberty and freedom is kind of the birthing point of the American women's movement. And I don't want you to confuse you because this is not feminism yet, all right? But increasingly, women are starting to see unlimited power in men's hand is just as bad as unlimited power in the king's hands. So, okay, so here comes this idea of Republican motherhood. Now, women play in this notion, women play a really major role in securing the future of the republic because women raise children. They raise men and they raise their boys into men. And it is their responsibility because they are the ones usually responsible for the education and teaching of their children, male and female. And it's their responsibility to raise the next generation of virtuous, civic-minded Republican male citizens to lead the country. So Benjamin Rush in 1787 writes an essay on female education in which he basically outlines the principles of Republican motherhood, saying that to fulfill their duty to the nation, women need greater access to education and intellectual development, saying how can women possibly teach their son to be civic-minded if they don't have education themselves? So listen, women's roles are staying the same. They're still caregivers and mothers and homemakers, but their roles in that have taken on an added dimension of political and civic importance. So their status within these roles starts to be elevated. So we are still decades away from even the first little tinglings of true feminism, but we are definitely going to start to see an expanded role for women in politics, at least when it comes to their raising of their children. Okay, so how did the revolution impact other places? Because revolutionary ideals from the American Revolution, I mean, are certainly, this was earth-shaking for a lot of the colonial sphere. So don't forget that France and Britain and Spain all had colonies elsewhere, and those colonies are going to look to the example of the United States and start to imagine revolutions of their own. So the French Revolution, okay, that's the first example. The French Revolution starts about 1789-ish, and it was very similar Enlightenment ideals that drove the French to overthrow the monarchy. When they kind of saw it was possible for the Americans to do it, they wanted to do it too. And it comes out really differently in France, as you probably remember from World History last year. But either way, the Enlightenment ideals is definitely going to inspire them in much the same way. The Haitian Revolution uses Enlightenment rhetoric to justify massive and successful slave uprising in Haiti that leads to the formation of the country of Haiti. This was, again, like I said, a lot of these words were written by founding fathers and early Enlightenment thinkers. They weren't necessarily intended to be for anyone but white men. But once this language exists, once this rhetoric of liberty and freedom and rights for all exists, other disenfranchised groups are going to kind of, this sort of opens the door and unlocks the door, and they're going to kind of kick that door open and move through it as we see using this language. And later on, we're going to see this in other movements. We're going to see this in the abolitionist movement. We're going to see this in the civil rights movement. We're going to see this in women's rights movements. We're going to see this in movements for just a huge number of other disenfranchised groups. And then across the world as well. Like Haiti uses this to justify their overthrow of this plantation economy and government. And then Latin American independence movement. So in the first decades of the 19th century, most American countries in South and Central America are then going to draw upon the U.S. example and overthrow imperial control. Now, it's worthwhile noting Latin American revolution independence movements are a lot more like the American Revolution insofar as they were mostly run by the elites, the wealthy, the upper class, the planters, and they looked to America as a perfect example of a revolution that overthrew their imperial controllers without overthrowing the status quo, because after all, America still had slavery. America still had this upper, wealthier elite class and lower classes. So, the social status wasn't turned upside down in the United States. It was revolutionary in one sense that they overthrew imperial control, but not so revolutionary in the sense that, rights for women and enslaved peoples and Native Americans did not emerge until much, 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 much later. So Latin American elite leaders are going to look to America as an example. What they were afraid of was like Haiti, where you did see an overthrowing of the entire social system and an end to slavery. So actually, Latin American independence movements were often delayed a few decades because they were kind of afraid of the Haitian example. But ultimately, they are going to use the U.S. example to overthrow imperial control in Latin America. Okay, so sorry, this isn't supposed to say Republican motherhood. That was just an accident. I'll fix it in the PowerPoint later on. But this is about how the U.S. is impacting revolutions in other places. And in the next video, we are going to start to get into the actual governance of the United States. We're going to start by talking about the Articles of Confederation, our very first Constitution. So I will talk to you guys about that next time.